All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Expected by Whom. I'm Prashanth Iyer, and with me as always, Sean Shapiro. And today we finally know the two teams that will be contesting for the Stanley Cup. So, Sean, Vegas, Florida, who you got, and kind of what's your thought heading into this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, it's the finals that obviously once teams win two rounds, we knew that it was going to be one of these two teams, but it's the finals that if you go back to the start, I don't think anyone would have. Obviously, no one was predicting Florida to be here. Everybody thought that historical Boston team was going to run them over and everything like that. So Dallas not Dallas. Wow, Dallas lost to Vegas. Florida beat Carolina, and two teams that it's kind of funny. Like if you look at the regular seasons, Florida is the team that you would have said last year was the team that they would have been the team to be there based off regular season. And obviously their coach from last year, interim coach after the Joel Quenneville firing not firing, Joel Quenneville stepped down, whatever terminology you want to use that the league is using, but he stepped down. And then Andrew Brunette was the interim coach who's actually, I believe, as we're doing this, probably being introduced as the coach in Nashville right now as we speak. So you have Florida, a team that was the classic last story in, playing off of the old LA Kings playbook of you don't have to be the best team you don't have to be great for 70 games. You just have to be playing those tough games to get into the final, to get in, and then you'll be ready, right? And so that's Florida, and then Vegas is the team who has already. I mean, it's almost like we probably all would have laughed at Bill Foley before when Bill Foley brought the team to Vegas. He made the claim at the time that seemed ludicrous, where he said, "We will be in the playoffs in 3 years, and I want to win a Stanley Cup in 6." This is year 6 for Vegas, and his playoffs in year 1 was playoffs by year 3 was to smash that expectation, and now they're in the Cup Final, where it's a Vegas team that we've talked about them a little bit before, but they're not. It's not because they got lucky in the expansion draft. It's how they aggressively manipulated the cap. It's how they went and built pieces. I wrote something for the folks over at EP Rinkside today, just about I look at, for me, Vegas reaching the final in 2018 is a great story, but for me, the current iteration of Vegas starts with the Mark Stone trade, where that was the statement to the rest of the league that this is how we're building. We're not a team that we're just going to be loyal to these golden misfits or whatever. We're going to always be in the market for the biggest and best names. And to me, the Mark Stone trade was really the ushering in of what Vegas really is, how George McPhee and Kelly McCrimmon attack things. So on the ice, it's two teams that are going to come. It's going to be. I know it's funny here because we've heard throughout these playoffs, people were talking about the lack of a big market, and things like that, and the lack of a traditional hockey market. But I think this series is going to be fun. I mean, it's going to be the same. It's going to be similar to me, I think, the way Florida Carolina played out, where there's going to be a lot of speed, some close games. I understand what Rod Brendamore was trying to say when he said his team wasn't swept, even though they lost 4-0, but every game was close. So the coin flip could have gone the other way. And I look at this series that way, and I look at it as it's going to be really interesting to see how these two teams play off of each other, the speed that both teams bring. And then the biggest one is going to be both of them are well rested. I know Florida's been rested for 10 days, but Vegas is 4 days. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So 5 days between games for Vegas. And can we really say that Monday night game against Dallas was really a game? I mean, Vegas just cruised. So you have two really well-rested teams that like to play fast, that like to get in deep on you. It's going to be give me a lot of excitement with this series, with the two teams play close games. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I know there's always going to be the people that are, clamoring about TV markets. Well, first of all, the Miami market is massive. And having two teams, both them and then the Miami Heat on the NBA side in the final, I mean, that's going to make for an absolutely sports crazy city down there. And so you have the markets already, but just stepping back and looking at the teams, I really want to highlight what you said about Vegas in terms of being an expansion team here. I mean, this is their 6th season, and this is their 4th time reaching the conference final or later. That's unbelievable. I mean, you know, for an expansion, not even just for an expansion team, any team. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous to make the conference final 4 times in 6 years in the post-cap era, in, you know, as an expansion team to be able to do that. And obviously a lot of that first year or two was definitely built by the expansion draft. But like you said, you know, going out after Mark Stone, going after Jack Eichel, going after Alex Pietrangelo, they made themselves very clear that they are going to go out and, you know, find ways to build a roster that is very different than what any other team is doing right now. And so kudos to them for being able to pull this off, for continuing to find ways to add to this roster while simultaneously, you know, getting the best out of the prospects that they are able to bring up and getting the best out of the, you know, the best value for them with their draft picks, whether it's trading them or using them. And so I think it's fascinating to just evaluate Vegas, because if you go back and you look at the history of expansion, you know, prior to Vegas, I mean, you got the Minnesota Wild and Columbus Blue Jackets who joined in 2000, 2001. Minnesota made one conference final, you know, since they've been a part of the league, and they scored 1 goal in that. Columbus has never made it that far. You know, the Thrashers were before them. They aren't around anymore. The Predators, you know, they've gotten to the Stanley Cup final once, but ultimately weren't able to be successful. And now you're talking about Vegas already just being there 2 times. And so it's an unbelievable run from an expansion team. And then I think for me on the other side, just like you said with Florida, they really do feel like a team of destiny. And I think they got written off a little bit earlier than maybe they should have, by myself included. I'm pretty sure if you go back and dig up a tweet from me, I thought Florida was going to drop off substantially. And I'm pretty sure I tweeted that right before the regular season, and had them maybe on the cusp of not making the playoffs, which, to be fair, they were on the cusp of not making the playoffs. Just now they're all of a sudden here in the Stanley Cup final. But this was a really dominant team last year, and kind of taking a page out of the Vegas book. They weren't content to sit with what they had after last season. You know, you have Jonathan Huberdeau score a whole bunch of points. Mackenzie Weegar, you know, goes out and has a great season, but they're willing to move both those guys to add a guy that they figured was a bona fide, you know, top 10 player in the world in Matthew Tkachuk. And sure enough, he's shown them that. So I'm really excited for this series. I think it's going to be a lot of fun between 2 teams that are extremely skilled. And, you know, I think we'll have a very competitive Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, no player is irreplaceable is another thing that you take away from this, where it's the move that Florida made to go get Tkachuk. I know a lot of people look at the fact where Tkachuk wanted out of Calgary, you know, all of that stuff and everything like that, but reality is they traded a guy who got MVP votes last year. They traded, there was no one most GMs do not have the guts to make that trade. Most, especially in hockey. We see those big guys get moved occasionally. We knew Tkachuk was going to get moved because of that, but the fact that Florida was willing to move the other big name, the other big contract to get there, that's a huge credit. We've seen Vegas, I think the way they've handled things have shown that, Marc-Andre Fleury basically gets dumped by the franchise after winning the Vezina for cap issues. Basically, you go to Vegas, you have to either put up and fit in the cap, or you're out, and it's not. And no one is immune to that. And it can be a risky way to run things, sure, but when you're winning games, it definitely works. Like Vegas, the way Vegas run things, it's one of the reasons they've been able to win, but it's also the winning has allowed them to do that as well at the same time. It's kind of a cyclical thing. The other thing about these 2 teams that I really kind of want to bring up, and I know we have a lot of people who listen to the show who are Red Wings fans and everything like that, and just kind of shows you about the path of what you have to do. I was talking to a GM a couple weeks ago who told me that they look at it where to win a cup, a team has to have 5 bona fide star players, right? Now star is depends on how wide you want to spread the net of star player is a big thing. But basically, you have to have basically the 5 bona fide guys where, you know what, this is a core of 5 you're going to build around. And you go through Vegas's lineup, and Vegas has 7 or 8 guys like that. You look at Florida's lineup, and it's some names where I think some people are realizing those guys are those guys now, but like the Vegas has 5 or 7 or 8 guys like that too now. These teams are deep. Obviously, the Tkachuk trade is the big one, and he's the big superstar. But I mean, between what's Carter Verhey's done, Sam Bennett, between kind of taking, you talk about finding a market inefficiency for a guy who probably cost himself some money by being his own agent, and Anthony Duclair. And I know his numbers haven't been eye-popping because of some injuries and stuff, but you talk about a guy in that role. These are 2 teams where it's been a willingness to do that. And the other thing about it, and I think it's impossible to ignore, because I don't think it's the reason a team wins or loses, but it definitely helps with cap building. And it certainly doesn't hurt that Tampa was obviously in the final for 3 of the last years. No matter whether Dallas or Vegas won, you have an all no income tax, state income tax final. And I know, I think sometimes it can be every certain, you can have bad state taxes and win the cup. The Kings won 2 cups. California taxes are ridiculous. And so I hate when teams use the, when people from from a Canadian market complain and say like, oh, well, not, but where I'm going with this is when you have advantages, you have to find the way to use them. When you're Toronto, you have the advantage of you have guys like, I mean, Jason Spezza at the end of his career, right? Jason Spezza could have gone and made more money playing somewhere else, but he wanted to play at home. John Tavares picked Toronto because he wanted to go home. You have advantages there. You also, when you're in the market like Nevada or Florida or Texas or Tennessee, you have the advantage, and you need to use your advantage to its strengths. You don't hear part of the pitch when, and I'm going to say this because I covered Dallas, but I covered Dallas so well, so I know a lot about their pitch. But I look at a guy who, and Joe Pavelski's free agency is very telling to me on that, where when Joe Pavelski went into free agency, there are only 2 places Joe Pavelski considered to sign with, Tampa and Dallas. And the reasons there were a couple reasons. One, he wanted a place with no state income tax after he had played in San Jose, where very high state taxes. He wanted a place where he could golf in January. Those are advantages that I know. Like, we always make the joke. Like, it's hilarious to me. Like, we make the joke of like, here's the Maple Leafs golf bag. Well, all 4 teams in the conference final, they've got guys who have been golfing since October. They've been golfing all year long. So it's use your advantages where you have them. And I mean, let's look at, we talked a lot about Bobrovsky in our last episode and everything like that. The other thing to me that these 2 teams did, we talked about goaltending. We talked about how the story of Bob is that you need to have another guy. The Adin Hill story is a great one, where he's a guy who was a backup in Arizona, who now plays on a team that used 4 different goalies at one point. They had 4-game win streak with 1 win by each goalie. The Vegas goaltending story is just as interesting and fascinating as the Florida one, but it doesn't have the $10 million contract. And this is forgetting that the highest paid Vegas goalie right now is sitting at home, and, well, I mean, he's getting sued for snake farm stuff still, right? Like, I think that's still happening. So I laugh when you hear like you can't create stories or there's not marketing or whatever. Like, this is a great final. The stories are great, and if you want to pretend that Vegas and Miami, and I know it's more Fort Lauderdale, but if you want to pretend that Vegas and South Florida are small markets, you got to look at a map and realize where they stand in the world. These are 2 places that pass the test for Formula One to come to. One of the world's largest global sports. There's 3 races in the United States. One's in Vegas, one's in Miami. That's the global appeal of these 2 markets too. So it's not a small market final. It's an untraditional market final, but that's really the only thing, and you can't even hold that against it.
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely can't hold any of that against either of the cities. And functionally, if you're the NHL, this is what you want. You want the game to grow in the cities where it hasn't traditionally been there, such that you have more teams sort of contributing revenue that ultimately leads to more NHL revenue, more hockey-related revenue, and thus higher salary caps and all the things that everybody really wants, to have access to. So this is what you want. You want this. You want to have these teams doing it. And even, beyond just the markets, beyond just, all of that discussion, there are absolutely great storylines. The Adin Hill one you brought up, tremendous storyline. He's a guy that prior to this postseason, I was sort of earmarking as a guy the Wings should be targeting. And now he may have priced himself out of, what the Red Wings are going to look to do. But I mean, he's a 6'4", 6'5", 215, 220-pound goalie. Like, that's the kind of goalie you maybe want a Sebastian Cossa to be learning from, with the way he's plays at such that athletic style, but also not overextending, finding ways to remain compact. Mark Stone's a guy that has been one of the most dominant two-way forwards in the game, has sort of flown under the radar for a long time now. He's the captain of this team and is, coming back from a big, bad back injury. Obviously, Jack Eichel, this is this first time in the postseason. Why aren't we writing the stories about, or more stories, I should say. There are stories out there, but there's Jack Eichel for the marketing. I mean, we've got an American-born hockey player that's leading Vegas against an American-born hockey player in Matthew Tkachuk. This is a great opportunity to grow the game in the United States, even more so, than it's already been there. So I completely agree with you on all of that. There's definitely lots of opportunities. And for me, when I look at this series, just to give a little bit more depth, I think, to it, Florida has already beaten three of the top teams in the league. Going through Boston, going through Carolina, and then going through Toronto, and then going through Carolina. And the fascinating thing about Florida is each of those three teams plays a very different style. Florida had the ability to basically adapt their game to a team that was aggressive on the forecheck, a team that preferred to carry in, and then a team that was sort of the best of both of those in Boston. And so I'm just very curious how Vegas sort of approaches that and how Vegas approaches that Florida forecheck, because it is so good. It's so aggressive. We saw that they find ways to buy themselves time. They've got very kind of heavy-minded forwards that really can dictate the physicality, but Vegas is right there too. So for me, I think this series comes down to which superstar is able to kind of drive a little bit more. Is it the Matthew Tkachuk line that continues, or is it Jack Eichel's line that finds a way to take control? Because this is just a lot of skill, a lot of physicality, a lot of speed. Going to be a lot of fun to watch.
Mark Stone is one of my favorite hockey players. He's been for a while. Mark Stone's one of my favorite hockey players to watch, and he's someone who, through the magic of timing and how podcasts work, we're going to learn some more about how teams look at data later in this show. But he's someone who I would love to get my hands on what the private data says about him, because I was talking to Jack. I was actually last week in Dallas between game 3 and 4 of that series. I was talking to Jack Eichel about Stone, and Eichel compared Stone's impact. And we always hear, it's also great. We have two in this series. On a side note, we have the two great who's the most underrated player in hockey. We have Barkov versus Stone, right? Like, the guy who's going to lift, whoever lifts the cup we will have one of the greatest, most underrated forwards in hockey lifting the cup, no matter what, at the end of this series. And, but Eichel brought up to me about it, said one of the things that Stone's impact has is it's very similar to a great defenseman. It's where he is someone who you don't realize how often he skates plays out of space, how he controls the positioning. We see all the, my pal Dmitry Filipovich has done really nice little edits, putting together all the steals and everything like that. But it's the other parts where he's not doing that. And it's the way he manipulates the space with his movement and his routes and everything like that. All these little things that you and I can watch and say that's wonderful. And once again, alluding to something we'll learn about a little more, I would love to know what the data shows on all the time for that, to see what type of impact he's having, because he controls the ice all the time, And it's kind of, Eichel's looked at him like he's like the way a great defenseman skates and controls. And it's kind of funny too, where it's like, because he's a winger, I think it almost naturally hurts his ability. And I'm not saying the Selke winner does not deserve to win the Selke, but like, because of how the award has been given historically, it's very hard for, I think Yuri Lehtinen was the last non-center to win it. Like, it's, wingers don't win the Selke. And Stone to me is kind of in that spot where he won't surpass like in the general conversation because he won't have won the Selke because of how voting changed. But you're talking about a guy who has a legit case for being maybe the greatest defensive winger in NHL history. Like, it's a fair claim. And I love seeing his story. I love seeing him. Obviously, he came back from the back surgery and everything like that. And it's he's a great hockey player. It's a great storyline too, where it's like him or Barkov. One of those two guys is going to be the first one to get the Stanley Cup, and both of them are underrated, as we bring up all the time. I do want to say on both of them, as much as I love Mark Stone, I don't like his decision to not touch the trophy. I love what Florida, I looked up the quote-unquote analytics on this after Florida touched the trophy. 7 of the last 8 champions have touched the conference trophy. When St. Louis beat Boston, neither team touched the trophy. So, when a team has touched the trophy, we have the winner has, when the team has touching the trophy is not a bad thing. It's a ridiculous superstition. So as much as I love Mark Stone, I hate that Vegas didn't touch the trophy. I love that Vegas celebrated and that Florida celebrated and enjoyed the moment. Touch the trophy. It's hard to win it. It doesn't stop you from winning the next one. So I'm here for your trophy takes too.
I mean, as far as the trophy stuff, to me, it doesn't really matter one way or another. I think it's, at least in the last few years, you've had teams touching the trophy because it was the same teams sort of getting through. Between, you have the Tampa run where they get to the final 3 times in a row, sorry. Prior to that, you had the Pittsburgh runs. And so it sort of felt like teams had been there and then were sort of comfortable touching it. I don't personally care. I think it's all, you decide as a team what you want to do. I buy the cliche of this isn't the trophy you want to win, and therefore it's not the one you want to touch. Like, you go over to the NBA and you watch the trophy presentation for the Miami Heat after they beat Boston, and Bam Adebayo is holding the Eastern Conference Final trophy and offers it to Jimmy Butler, and you just see Jimmy Butler shaking his head no, and then he goes, "I'll hold the next one." I actually love that mentality. I'm totally fine with that. So I don't really have any problem with the decision to kind of forego celebrating with a trophy. I think ultimately you decide as a team, what you want to do with that. But I personally like the mentality of, this isn't the one you want to hold, and until you've had the other one, there's no reason to really be chasing this one. And I like that kind of killer instinct. But I do want to go back to one thing you said about Mark Stone being one of the best defensive wingers in hockey. It must, when I think about him, and then prior to him, I think it's Marian Hossa that maybe had that claim in the last 20 plus years. Boy, did it suck to have their careers overshadowed and overlapped by Patrice Bergeron and Pavel Datsyuk. Like, you just think about it. Both those guys were arguably 2 of the greatest defensive wingers you're ever going to see. And the reason neither one of them ever gets to win the Selke is because Hossa is overshadowed by Datsyuk, and then Datsyuk gives way to Patrice Bergeron. And you've just had this, 15-year, dominance by those 2 guys, sprinkled in with your Jonathan Tays, your Ryan O'Reillys, your Alexander Barkovs. But it's hard. It's hard to get it in. And so I hope that Mark Stone gets remembered more favorably, when his career is all said and done. And I think a Stanley Cup here would go a long way towards doing that. But he really, truly is one of the greatest defensive wingers hockey has ever seen. And he's just not going to get the hardware for it because arguably the 2 greatest defensive centers overshadowed his time.
Yeah, I mentioned Lettinen before, but Hossa is that middle gap of wingers. Like you're going the Lettinen, then Hossa, then Stone. Like that's over. If you go back the past 25 years, that's the greatest defensive wingers. And I hope with Stone's case, I wonder. I do wonder if his career, if there's more data that has been tracked that we will later get out to the rest of us maybe 5 to 7 years from now, that I wonder if that will start painting some more interesting pictures of impact and everything like that. So I'm really interested to see that. With these teams too. The other thing that's interesting about both these teams that we haven't even touched on yet is both teams brand new coaches in this year one of a coach. Bruce Cassidy was let go in Boston. Jim Montgomery goes over to Boston. They have a historic season, and I mean, I'm not saying that the Bruins beat Florida if Bruce Cassidy is the coach, but I also wonder if Jim Montgomery got out-coached in that series when Florida beat Boston. But so Bruce Cassidy goes to Vegas, and he does a really good job not changing the core identity of the team, but changing how they got. I mean, one of the reasons Vegas was able to succeed this year with so many goalies and everything like that was the fact where they do such a good job of building those layers to block shots. And I love the way Vegas blocks shots because it's more of a fronting to the shooter right away. There's two different, like, there's one of the, is Chris Russell still in the NHL? I mean, Chris Russell was always one of like the most like famous shot blocker, but Chris Russell was always blocked a ton of shots near the goalie. And there'd be a lot of shots that when you're blocking shots like that, you're creating sometimes, if it gets through, you're creating some more deflections and tips on your own. I love the way Vegas fronts shooters right away where they block shots, because it's something where if it does get through, the goalie still has time to react, as opposed to kind of building this. It's the same reason why we saw one of the underrated things about Henrik Lundqvist's career, and we have obviously big Henrik Lundqvist fans on this podcast. Lundqvist always played a little bit deeper in his crease, so he had time to read off of that. There was a big story this year where Linus Ullmark, in his regular season performance, I'm trying to complete blank on the technique, but basically as the shot was being taken, he would take about half a stride back as the shot came in because it gave him a little bit extra time to read the shot. And the way Vegas blocks shots, their goalies get a little bit more natural time when something does get through. I love that about Vegas. Bruce Cassidy brought that in. Paul Maurice comes into Florida and now the team is completely changed. Bill Zito completely revamps the team, obviously, and they basically change from a team that was relying more on carrying the puck in, more on skill, and just having to rely on the skill to. They went from hoping their skill would win out to having their skill outwork the other team. That's what Florida went through. They kind of became that cliche of like, effort beats skill unless skill works harder, or whatever the cliche is. And that's what Maurice brought in there and really worked with the team on that. And I like the way they clearly adjust. They adjusted in the offseason, revamped the team. I love how they as you said earlier, adjust from round to round. And that's something where, to me, that reflects more on the coaching than anything else, because a lot of coaches, you win a round, you're not going to change. A lot of you win a game, you're not going to change. That's not the case with Florida, and it's I mean, but give them credit, right? Like the whole the Bobrovsky story, and we had a whole pod where we talked about Bob earlier, but it's not. They could have easily, when Alex Lyon was the guy down the stretch, they could have easily said, "Let's go to the $10 million guy." They didn't do that. They went with what worked. And I think that's something where that's hopefully the copycat thing. If you're an NHL team and you're looking like, okay, what do we want to bring forward? It's like, look at teams that are willing to adjust and look at the how and why we're winning or losing is great. I mean, and I think that's Honestly, I'll let you add anything more you want, but I think that's a great segue to our guest about on the how and why of winning and losing. If you want to go with that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that's a tremendous segue for us here. And so before we get into that, I'll if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/wingwheelpodcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wing Wheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which will have an Expected by Whom dedicated channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. So, Sean, you've been teasing this a little bit throughout the episode here. And now what we're very excited to do is we've brought on a guest, Eric Tulsky of the Carolina Hurricanes, has joined us to speak a little bit about kind of his journey into analytics, how the Carolina Hurricanes have built up their impressive analytics department, what tracking data has sort of meant to his team, as well as kind of what the quality of data looks like on the private side versus the public side through his perspective, and then ultimately some advice for people looking to get into it. And so without further ado, let's go to the interview with Eric here. All right, folks, we've got another exciting interview. Very thankful for Eric Tulsky of the Carolina Hurricanes for taking the time to join us. Most of you should be familiar with Eric, but for those who don't know, it's been with the Carolina Hurricanes coming up on almost 10 years now, working in a variety of roles and capacities, and now all the way up to the AGM level. And so, Eric, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And first off, congratulations on a tremendous season. The Hurricanes have once again, 5 years in a row now, winning a playoff round, the only NHL team that can say that. You and I talked about that. And so tremendous work that you guys have done there. What I wanted to sort of kick this off with is if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your professional journey and kind of how you decided you wanted to work in hockey, because you have arguably the most impressive resume of anybody that works in hockey. So I'd love if you could share that, a little bit of that with us.
Yeah, it was a strange journey. So I got a PhD in chemistry. I was working in a series of technology companies, spent 5 years at a global biotech conglomerate working on applications in clinical imaging and DNA sequencing. Left there and worked at a couple different startups, one for a couple years on solar energy, one for a couple years on batteries for electric vehicles. And on the side, completely independently, nothing to do with that, I had a hockey stats blog and was just writing for the fun of it, enjoying it. My work kind of caught on, and somebody talked me into sort of pinging teams and seeing if I could find a consulting gig here or there. Sent out basically a round of spam to everybody whose name I could get, and got one reply, and did a project for them basically for free. They got a little bit of exposure for it, but not much else. But then the next time I sent out a round of spam, now I have a recommendation from them that I can attach, and so now it get a little more reading the next time, and I got another one-off project. And then one of the times that I sent out a thing saying I was looking for work, the Hurricanes replied, and they reached out and talked about doing a whole series of reports. And we met at the draft in Philadelphia and sort of talked through what it would look like. And I wrote up a proposal that was basically 20 or 25 hours a week of work. Spent a year doing that on the side in addition to my day job, and was stretched really thin that year. And at the end of the year, told them, this has been great. I don't think I can do it like this forever. And they asked if I'd be interested in coming on full time. I anguished about it quite a bit because I had all this training and experience in one field that I was walking away from. Had a friend who lived in both worlds a little bit. He's a mechanical engineer and also a hockey blogger with a stat focus, who told me, look, there's always going to be another job at, Apple or whatever company it is. There's no chance you look back when you're 65 and kick yourself and say, why didn't I take the job with Apple? And he basically talked me into giving it a shot. So I signed a 2-year contract to start and figured if it didn't work out, I could go back to chemistry after 2 years and it would be okay. If I got a second contract, now I'm 4 or 5 years out of chemistry, it gets a little bit harder to go back. But at that point, I've turned myself into something that looks like a data scientist, and there's a whole new field open to me. And so figured I'd just give it a shot and see how it went. And it went really well. It's been great from day one. So never had any thought of going back.
Kind of in that vein, you talk about never having any thought of going back. Is it the part where you go from kind of doing 20 to 25 hours a week to full time, or when you're is there a moment where you look at it and you're like, I'm in hockey now? Like, is there a moment where you stop and think that this is where I am? Like, is there any way you can take us to that?
Yeah, so I don't know if there was a moment, but it was definitely a strange transition for me, because even up at the point where I was sending out notes asking about consulting work, I was still thinking of it as a project here and there. Even at the point where it was, a big project that was sort of, 20, 25 hours a week, it was still just something I did on the side. And I was not even thinking about it as a career path. It was only at the end of the year when, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next year that it sort of hit me that this is really something I could do. And so that was neat. It was, I didn't get into it hoping to start a career. I got into it messing around with stats and having fun figuring out what I could say about hockey players. And having that, sort of suddenly like, whoa, wait, this is my job now. Like, I spent 15 years training to be a chemist and now I'm a full-time hockey guy. But that's what happened.
And it kind of that summer of 2014, the summer of hockey analytics, we saw a lot of people from kind of the public sector get hired by teams and everything like that. When you kind of look back on that summer and the number of hirings and things like that, is it something where, do you look at that as like, I think we've talked about as kind of like a flashpoint where teams were kind of really not taking this seriously is the wrong word, but really we're diving in deeper and adding to their resources. Like, how do you look back at that summer of 2014 as someone who was one of the people who was hired as well during that?
Yeah. So the teams that made hires that summer, I'm sure we're all paying attention to stats before that, right? That was not their first moment of wondering what was going on out there. The transition that happened that summer was teams went from having an internal employee whose job was to mostly pay attention to what was going on in the blogs and what it meant for them, to trying to bring someone in and create something proprietary. And that is a big step. The transition from making sure you're not missing out on what's out there to trying to get ahead of what's out there that's a bigger investment and a bigger step to take. Honestly, like in those first years, I think the bigger factor, the advantage of having someone in-house was less about the research they were going to do in that first year or 2 or 3, and more about just having them shoulder to shoulder with people to talk about the problems that they needed to talk through. And the communication's better. You can design your reports for them directly. Like you can work so much better on the communication and making sure everything is getting across as intended and hitting the right notes. And I think that was the biggest value of coming in-house early on.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear you speak about that. And in your almost decade now in Carolina, you guys have built arguably one of the most, complete analytics departments. And we've really seen that go all the way back to 2014 with that, flashpoint you talk about. I want to touch a little bit on the communication aspect that you just brought up. how important is that ability to communicate, particularly as you're sort of stepping in from a different background, a different mindset, and working with people that don't have that same exposure or familiarity with the information you're talking about? Can you walk us through a little bit about not necessarily what you did specifically, but just in general, your thoughts on being able to communicate that information in a relatable manner?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about. One is just in terms of what kind of questions you're asking. There are things that are already on people's minds, and if you can find a way to answer those, that goes a lot farther for them than trying to get them interested in something new that they've never really thought about before. So as an initial step, it's like going in and saying, hey, I know you've been debating whether to, do this or that. Here's some data that can help inform that. I think that sort of helps people understand how they're supposed to use this and think about it. I also think one thing that can be different is people who are from very non-technical backgrounds and have never really used data before often need much simpler visualizations and tables than people are used to. Like a scatter plot is second nature to someone who's been working in data for a long time, and really foreign to someone who hasn't. It's not immediately obvious what all these dots are, or why some of them are over here. What am I supposed to be looking at? There's just a cloud of dots on the screen. And so that kind of like just thinking through what your audience is going to be used to and how they're going to think about it, and how to make sure that what you're showing them is immediately interpretable and doesn't require them to spend energy thinking about what am I supposed to take away from this. I think there's a lot of value in that, and that's not always second nature to people who have been writing for a technical audience for a long time. I also think, a lot of it is just, I was lucky that when I was hired, I was brought in by a management group that really wanted to hear what I had to say. And what happens early on, there are going to be lots of things where you agree with people and a handful of things where you disagree. And everything where you disagree is basically a tiny little bet of credibility. And if you win enough of those bets, you accumulate a big chip stack and people stop wanting to take the other side of your bet. But they have to be paying attention to how your bet's played out. And that comes from them being interested in what you have to say and remembering this was what he said about this, and being able to look back and say, yeah, that played out. So there's always sort of that proving period where you demonstrate that your stuff has value, but you only get to that proving period if you have an audience that thinks you have a chance of proving something. And I was lucky to land in a place that really wanted to hear from the start what I could add and how.
It's more common now that we see paths to your role, the AGM role. We see the more quote unquote things that would have been non-traditional in the past. We see more non-traditional paths to that job now. But when you talk about those bets and your bets on credibility, and you're building yourself. We talked earlier about how you went from now I'm in hockey and I'm doing this. When you're going up, did you ever think like, hey, AG, assistant GM, like is this ever something that even pops on as you're in the process of it? It's a role now where it doesn't surprise us to see someone go through your path, but you're a trailblazer in this path to how you get to an assistant GM role. Did you ever think about that as you're kind of moving your way up in this, and it goes from in your role increases and things along those lines?
Probably not directly. I mostly think about our own organization and how I can help. The promotion to AGM was when I really, that was a formalization of my impact going beyond the analytics group. And so that was really a recognition that the experiences I had in my past lives of managing groups, leading small organizations, sort of thinking about how this group and that group are going to work together, how they're going to exchange information, how we're going to set up a timeline and make sure they're getting what they want in the timeline they wanted, and plan out what we're going to do when. That kind of strategic thinking and organizational thinking is way beyond the mandate of an analytics group. It's just sort of basic leadership ability. And the recognition that I had a bunch of training and experience in that led to looking for opportunities for me to be able to bring that to things other than just, here's what the data says about this player. And so I guess it's 3 years ago now, I got promoted to AGM. And at that time, I was asked to start also overseeing the pro scouting group as well as the data group. And, I'd never written a scouting report in my life before. So this wasn't a promotion to head scout. It was promotion to overseeing the scouting group and helping to figure out how we should be writing reports, what they should look like, how we should target which players we're going to write up, how we should communicate that out to the organization, how we should give the scouts feedback on their reports and make sure that they're hitting the right things. And that sort of managerial skill set, it has really served me well in terms of being able to do more than just the analytics that was the foot in the door. So my entry-level job was analyst. My current role is a managerial role.
Kind of getting back to the data, you touched on that there. When you look at the availability now of tracking data, and I'm curious of how that impacts your processes. And as someone who's worked with public available data before, how different would you, for what you can tell us, how differently would you say that is compared to the private data that teams use now?
Yeah, so I think the difference really just comes down to resolution. So the NHL's data set is going to have, an average of about an event every 10 seconds. And so, you can think of it like the lights are off for 9.9 seconds and you flick them on and flick them back off. And you wait 9.9 more seconds and flick them on and flick them back off. And it's not even that regular. You might get 3 flicks in a second and then go 30 seconds without any lights. And trying to figure out what happened in the game is really hard because 30 seconds, you've got a shot at this end and then 28 seconds later, you've got a hit at that end. And I don't know what happened in between, right? And so your window into what each player did is really thin when you have that little information. And so most of the work that's done with public data is based on inferring individual impact by looking at the team results with the player on the ice and figuring, well, I don't have a direct view into everything he did, but I know what the results were, so he must have done something right. And that's powerful, and it's, it can be done well, but it still leaves you with a lot of questions about what he actually did and whether it's going to be a fit on this team and, how much credit to really give him for it. So sort of the next level, there are third-party vendors that provide basically enhanced play-by-plays where instead of 300 events per game, you're getting 3,000. And so it's like flicking the light on once per second instead of once every 10 seconds. And it's still incomplete, but it's a lot better now if you have every pass and reception, and that you start to be able to tell a lot more about what each player did to make those things happen. And so, sort of the first transition in this role was from just figuring out what we can say with that public data to diving into this richer play-by-play and doing research on what else that can tell us and how we can communicate it. And now in the last year or two, we've started to get tracking data where instead of flicking the lights on and off once a second, we're doing it 10 times a second. And now, we know every stride you take on the ice instead of every time you receive a pass. And so that's a whole different volume of information. And the research is really just getting started on what we can do with that.
And this is something where I've always been curious because oftentimes we hear one of the outside voices. We sometimes hear when a team, either positively or negatively, sometimes a team will win or lose and people will be like, oh, well, the analytics guys got it right or they got it wrong or whatever. I just wanted to, very simply, when you look at the league, in your estimation, what's the base level usage of analytics across the league? Because I think too often people don't come in with that context and we just hear the Twitter takes one way or the other sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I hate to do this to you, but I don't really know, right? It's the other teams don't tell me how they're using their analysts or what they're doing with it. So there are teams that I think have a research group that I respect a lot that clearly has a lot of horsepower, and I imagine they wouldn't be making that kind of investment if they weren't using it. But I honestly don't know. For all I know, they're not listening to that group at all. I just, that group, I know the people in it. I think they're great. They're probably churning out great work. I would expect they're being listened to, but I'm as much of an outsider when it comes to some other team as anyone else is. That being said, I do think it's probably pretty safe to infer that when a team starts hiring serious technical people and building out a multi-person group and finding, real horsepower, that's not cheap, and teams don't like to waste money. So I think it's a safe bet that when they're making that kind of investment, they're doing something real with it. What's harder to know is I think there's a lot of teams that have one or two people, maybe from a technical background or maybe not. And some of those people, I'm sure, are being very listened to. The team just has not yet been ready to make a bigger investment. And others, probably don't have as much of a voice. And it's really hard to know from afar which ones are which.
Yeah, it comes back to a little bit of what you said earlier in terms of organizational buy-in and just having that opportunity where the fit, I think, ultimately works for both sides and the information is good, and you're winning your bets and folks are sort of able to hop on and buy in fully. I'm going to completely shift gears here on a question here for you. A lot of what our focus on this podcast is sort of trying to make analytics information more accessible, helping people get their starts, things along those lines. What advice could you offer to somebody looking to get their start or looking to make a little headway in terms of hockey analytics?
Yeah, so it's tricky. There's an old thing that when you ask somebody who has had some accomplishments in a field how to mirror those accomplishments, they always just tell you about their own path, right? And it's this is what worked for me. It'll work for you too. And I fall into that same category, both in terms of the way I think about a path and in terms of the way I think about what makes someone likely to have success. The thing that's tricky is the way information gets shared these days is different from 10 years ago. There aren't very many real full blog posts written these days. And it used to be every day there were 2 or 3 or 4 stats blog posts published somewhere. And the hard part was keeping track of all of them and keeping up with all of them. And I would have a hard time finding 2 or 3 real research posts in a week now, I think. And that's not because there's less work being done. It's just because it's in a different format now. It's, people are sharing stuff in Twitter threads, or they're just discussing it without ever having really written it up, or maybe they're writing an academic journal article about it. It's just the outlets are different. The path that worked for me was putting it out in blog posts and having comment sections where you discussed it with people, and having Twitter threads where you discussed it with people. And those discussions were super valuable to me. But having the sort of fully specified description of what I'd done and how I did it and how it was useful was also really important to seed that conversation and make sure we were all talking in the same way, and make sure somebody coming in late from a team or something could follow what I had done and how I got there. So I don't know. I mean, it's in 2023, I think it's hard to say, the path is go start a blog and put your work out there. I do think putting your work out there in some fashion is really valuable, though. I think those conversations really drive your own perspective of what questions are out there and your own understanding of how people will look at them. And it also just gives team employees a way to see how you think. And, we post a job and we're going to get 500 resumes, and not all of them are qualified, but probably 200 of them will be. And so distinguishing between those 200 from a resume is really hard. And when there are people where I'm like, oh, I know how this person thinks. I really like the way they approach problems. Like, obviously, that's a path to the short list. And being able to create that understanding for people, I think, is really powerful.
I think in today's day and age, it's kind of one of the most wonderful and intimidating things at the same time is, and as someone who went to journalism school and have had people reach out, like the first time you realize how much teams are paying attention, like hockey people they digest a ton of information. It's something where it's an information business. It's a sport, but it's an information business. I think people sometimes don't realize how much is digested by teams and digested people within organizations, even almost on a daily basis, just because we think, oh, there's this wall, but there's really people looking through it. And I think people forget that sometimes. Just, I know that firsthand where there's times where I think maybe Eric, one of your and I's first interactions was something where, like, I think you sent me a message about something where I can't remember what it was, but it was, you sent me a message to clarify something. And it was just like, I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, great. Like it's one of those spaces where if you're, and this is more for people listening, you both obviously know this, where you have this medium now where you can share your work with the world and people are going to pay attention if you do a good job. I wanted to kind of, Eric, I wanted to circle back real quick, a little bit farther back in your history. You talked about you've got, I think, you looking at your bio on the Canes website. I don't know how many other people have 19 patents listed on their team bio and everything.
Bio's actually out of date. I have 26 now.
Okay. And so 26 patents. But before the career and the hockey blog, what got you into the sport in the first place? Like, what was if you go back even deeper, was it, what got you to the rink? What got you into the sport in the first place before there was ever I'm doing a hockey blog?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I'm a sports fan. I've followed hockey for a long time. I've followed other sports for a long time also. I think what got me sort of neck deep in hockey instead of sort of chest deep was when I started to come across hockey stats work. And, I sort of early on, I was part of the Broad Street hockey community, and they were very interested in what people were doing with hockey stats. They didn't really have anyone on their staff who was super technical. They were interested in it, but didn't 100% understand it or know what to do with it. And so I found myself playing a role as a translator early on, where I, took the math and turned it into human. And, here's what all of that means for understanding the team that's on the ice today and the contract that's about to be signed. And that, that really it was just happenstance that it was hockey that I ended up in that was at that stage where it was early enough that just explaining the basics created a route in. And there was still a lot of low-hanging fruit where I found myself, describing, they looked at this, it seems like they probably should have covered this wrinkle. I don't know why nobody has yet. Maybe I'll go do that. Whereas if I'd gotten into baseball stats in 2009, like, forget it. There's nothing left low hanging. And it's a hard entry point. You have to be very serious to step in when there's so much covered ground already. So honestly, like, that was what sucked me in. I was a hockey fan. I'd followed the game. I was, followed it enough that I was reading hockey blogs every day. But what made it into something that I was going to go spend 25 hours a week on the side in addition to my day job was finding that entry point where I felt like I had something to contribute to the community and some interesting things to look at and, basically little puzzles to solve.
That's awesome. Because going back to something you said earlier where you're like, this was just sort of work. You were kind of just teasing or messing around and figuring stuff out. I love how it's still stuff that 10 years later I'm referencing and other folks are still referencing. I mean, even if it was low-hanging fruit, it sort of set itself as the gold standard. And so, I think for that reason, we all thank you for the contributions you made in the public work back then, and kind of how impactful it still is in driving a lot of what I personally do and other folks do. So yeah, I mean, I just can't say enough about, the public work you were able to put out, and hopefully, we can continue to build upon all this stuff that you've gotten started for us. Sean, you got any other questions before we let Eric go?
Nothing formally hockey related. I was going to give you a chance. I mean, the most impressive, prettiest background so far on the show for people who are watching this. I mean, there's if you're listening, and there's a pretty impressive painting behind Eric. So I figured I'd give him a chance to give some credit there, but nothing hockey related more.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, that's my wife's artwork. You can find it at KarenSosaFineArt.com. Give her a link.
And we'll drop that link in the YouTube section so folks can find it. Yeah, Eric, greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Best of luck next season, and hopefully we can chat again soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We want to thank Eric for taking the time out of his day to chat with us, share his expertise, his insight. Obviously, as one of the pioneers of hockey analytics in this field, he's one of the smartest people you could ever hope to be able to talk to. And so we're very fortunate that he took the time out of his day to chat with us. So to wrap up here, I want to talk about one of the debates that I've seen going around, and largely because Florida's been off for 10 days and people have nothing better to kick around, but the Conn Smythe debate here. We talked a lot about Bobrovsky on our last episode, but ultimately, whether Florida wins, Vegas wins, how are you handicapping the Conn Smythe odds at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we know it happens in hockey is someone from the losing team can win. More than 90. Like, we've got only less than a handful of times someone from the losing team has won, but it is possible. It's the other thing about the Stanley Cup, the Conn Smythe, and which is different than other leagues. The NBA, right? It's the MVP of the finals. It's the MVP of that series. The Super Bowl is the Super Bowl MVP. The World Series is the MVP of the World Series, not the entire playoffs. This is the one trophy, the one individual player award league where they give out an MVP of the entire playoffs, which I think is something that is, it's kind of cool, right? We have other leagues. You have they do it by round and things like that. It's kind of cool to have this from where it's what you did to help the team get all 16 wins, or if you lost, but to get there matters in this case. And that's why it's the space where if somebody comes out of nowhere and goes off in the Stanley Cup Final, that's great. They could be the MVP of the Stanley Cup Final, but that doesn't mean they're the MVP of the playoffs. I love that part of the Conn Smythe. I look at this like you come into the Conn Smythe here, and the big debate we've had and heard everything is the Bobrovsky versus Tkachuk space. Okay, is it Bobrovsky? Is it Tkachuk? If Florida wins, who's it going to be? I would almost argue that we're going into the space, and it's fitting because the finals in Vegas, so you can add gambling references. But it would be the 1 year where it's I would be I wouldn't be opposed to you could bet that there's a really good chance it could come from Florida either way, just because you look at how Vegas has played and you look at their season, and they're such a deep team, and you look at there's a case for, we talked a lot about Stone earlier, right? Didn't really score late much in the Western Conference Final. I think it's 15 points or whatever. He's been good, but they've been so deep in it. There hasn't been one guy, even their goalie didn't start. Even their goalie, well, good, didn't have the same impact that Bobrovsky has had and everything like that. And so we could see a space where Florida gets the Conn Smythe winner either way. And to explain a little bit how that happened, so there's the narrative on that, but then let me explain a little bit how that actually could happen. So as long as the voting hasn't changed, there will be 18 voters for the Conn Smythe, right? 18 voters, 18 media members that have covered the series. Typically, it's a mix of about it's usually about 4 or 5. I think it's about 4 or 5 writers who have covered those two respective teams all year. So like in Florida, like George Richards will have a vote from Florida. Jesse Granger will have a vote from Vegas. You'll have those people and then about a dozen national people. And you get 3 votes, 1 through 3. So I think if Florida wins the cup, it'll either be Tkachuk or Bobrovsky. But if Vegas wins the cup, you might get a couple different, but I think Bobrovsky, at least, especially if Vegas wins, Bobrovsky, I can still see Bobrovsky just jumping up on a bunch of ballots where it's like 3rd here, 2nd there, whatever. And then because of the split nature of a lack of a true number 1 candidate from Vegas, like Bobrovsky could take it because of the split vote on Vegas. Like so I see a space where just because of how the voting works and how the two teams have made it there, like, I'm not saying Florida will win the cup. I'm not making that prediction, but I don't think I'd be crazy predicting Florida to win to bring the Conn Smythe home, whether they win the championship or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what you're boiling it down to is voters, regardless of whether or not Florida wins, are going to find a way to have Bobrovsky and even Tkachuk on their ballot. But because there hasn't necessarily been an individual standout from Vegas, you may have voters pick from a pool of players such that no one player kind of garners unanimous support. And you've got a Conn Smythe winner that's kind of carried all of the 2nd and 3rd place votes, whether it's Bobrovsky or Tkachuk. And by virtue of that, they come out ahead. And, functionally, that's probably how it happens if one of those guys is to pull it off. Now, it's very rare. We've had it 2 times in the last 40 years. And of the 5 times where it's happened, only once has it been a skater. Bonus points to anybody who can recall that skater without having to look it up. But that does stack it a little bit against Matthew Tkachuk if Vegas does win this. But I think in order for Florida to take that in that scenario, it would have to be a very competitive series. You'd have to have this go 6-7 games, a lot of close, 1-goal games. And if it's going to be Bobrovsky, he's got to have a couple of signature performances. The last time this happened, 2003, J.S. Jaguar, obviously he was coming off of the most remarkable conference final performance we've ever seen with the .992 save percentage. And then to carry that Ducks team all the way to Game 7 against that very good New Jersey Devils team, it was hard not to give it to him, particularly when the Devils didn't necessarily have that one standout. Obviously, they had Brodeur, they had, Patrick Elias, and they had other good players there, but not necessarily anybody who had a tremendous postseason in and of itself. So I'm with you. I think if Florida can push this 6 or 7, I would not be shocked that Bobrovsky is taking this either way, just based upon the narrative. But if Florida wins, I personally think this goes to Matthew Tkachuk. Obviously Bobrovsky has held them in some games, but Tkachuk has been there for every big moment. He scored 3 overtime game winners, which is already tied for the most in a playoff history. If he gets another one, he'll have the mark all by himself. He has absolutely elevated the play of every other player on his team. And the truly crazy thing that's going to maybe fly under the radar is you're talking about a guy who's got a 5-on-5 expected goals for percentage of 58%, despite playing Boston, Carolina, and Toronto. Like, those were 3 of the top teams in the league. So he's been absolutely unbelievable. He would have my vote if I were voting here, but I do think that scenario where Vegas wins in 6 or 7, I would not be stunned if Bob takes it there.
And I think this is going to be a close series. So I think we're going to be in that situation no matter what. I think this is going to be a close series. The Tkachuk thing is really interesting. And do we want to say who won the Conn Smythe, or do we want to let people the player? Because I know who it is, and I know the scenario that happened. But do we want to say that on the podcast, or do we want?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll give it out. It's Reggie Leach, 1976 with the Flyers. And
the key thing Reggie Leach did I don't know. I don't think the record stands anymore, but like he set the record for goals in the playoffs like that year. Like,
yep,
like
19 goals that year.
So it's so that was the case with Reggie Leach.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, it does still stand. It does still stand.
Yep.
Yeah, Jari Kurri's the only guy who's tied it. So
yeah, that's impressive too. That's even stood through. Like there's been. Like, I would have thought, I remember reading something about how there was a chance where the 2020 bubble, when we had all those extra playoff games, where you had teams playing round-robin games and you had extra series, there was a chance where someone was going to have played more games, so many more games, and set these records that would be with extra sample size. So even more impressive what Leach did. Chuck, to me, the other thing on the voting perspective that will be interesting is, and this is humans vote for awards, right? And humans vote for awards, and if it comes down to you're having the hard debate in your head, and you're a journalist and a storyteller, Matthew Tkachuk, who is becoming hockey's first, at least in a long, long time, first truly sport that is actually like. Can you remember, is there any other hockey player that could actually go onto the set of an NBA broadcast and people would actually know who they are? Like, we haven't had, like, that's, like, someone who's actually really good for the sport story-wise, and someone who is, not that he's not an American story, right? Matthew Tkachuk is an American story, so It's not supposed to impact the voting. It's not supposed to be how you make it but humans vote on awards. And when it comes down to, if you got it neck and neck, you're probably going to start leaning towards the American dude who is raising the profile of the sport in the United States right now, and is and has really been the storyline that has been fun to tell as well. So it's one of those where if this is a close series, and I think it will, if Vegas wins, I could see Bobrovsky winning it. If Florida wins, I could probably see Tkachuk winning it, because it's hard to ignore those goals and everything like that and everything. It's either way, it'll be. I think the series will be fun. I think the games will be close. I think both teams will. I know a lot has been made about the Florida rest and how long they've played. It's been since they've played and everything like that. And I know it's 10 days, but I truly believe, like, would we have wanted to rush this and have Vegas playing on 2 days rest? Eventually, Florida was going to sit there for a while anyway. Like, the difference between Florida playing after 8 days and playing after 10 days. I'd rather have Florida playing after 10 days if it means I get slightly better version of Vegas and better hockey as a consumer. That's where I come on this, and so that's a bit of my soapbox, because I think once a team has sat for 5 days or more, it doesn't really matter whether they've sat for 2 weeks or a year.
You would think that's common sense, but the NHL may want to go back and revisit the 2009 Stanley Cup Final, where that didn't work out necessarily that way. And, maybe some listeners on of this podcast might be very intimately familiar with what happened back then, but we won't go into it because we all pretend that June 2009 didn't actually happen. And we just sort of leave it at that. And so, folks, appreciate everybody tuning in for another episode of Expected by Whom. As always, if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, please direct those to the direct messages of Ryan Hanna, and he will be more than happy to address them. Until next time, guys, we'll catch you later.